Evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in and inviting you to our third lecture of this series, which is Responding to Climate Change in Squamish with a focus toward adaptation. Before we get going, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Squamish First Nations. The majority of us are not gathered together, but we are all on this beautiful land, and would like to acknowledge that there's a group of people who have been here for a lot longer than many of us, who had a very intimate knowledge and awareness of climate, of natural responses, and of resource management. I would now like to hand it over to Mayor Elliott for an introduction.
Thank you so much, Ian, and welcome to the third evening in our climate change lecture series. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Tonight, Ian will be talking again about our 6 big moves in the Community Climate Action Plan, but also about adaptation. So last time we talked about mitigation, and tonight we're thinking about adaptation, and it's quite timely, and I was talking with Ian about this earlier today. COVID-19 has shown us how quickly humans can adapt if we need to, but it's also pretty painful. And if you look outside of your own experience, we know that people in Squamish are struggling because of loss of income. Their mental health might be struggling because they find it challenging to be self-isolated. And if we look further afield in developing countries where it's not possible to self-isolate at home or have a job where you can work from home, we know that poor people around the world are really struggling in this pandemic. And so adaptation isn't necessarily the path we want to pursue as the solution to climate change. It is, I feel, a harder path potentially, especially if the changes come quickly. And so that's why it's important to think of this in balance with our mitigation efforts. We are adapting, and Ian will talk about some of those things that are happening in Squamish around adaptation. But really, our focus also must be on mitigation. And I said this last week, we always need to put an equity lens across this. This will impact people differently. And we cannot simply find solutions that work well for some of the population. We have to find solutions that work well for everybody. So again, I know I will be challenged by Ian's pop quizzes. Thankfully, he is not publishing my answers, but I appreciate the knowledge I've gained from each of these lectures. He's not dumbing it down. He keeps it pretty serious, stretches certainly my mind to think about this in different ways, and I've learned something from each evening. So thank you all for being here, and we'll look forward to having you as part of the community conversation over time as we implement the Community Climate Action Plan. I will turn back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Mayor Elliott. That was a wonderful introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ian Picketts, and I'm the Manager of Sustainability and Climate Change here at the District of Squamish. And this is our third of 4 presentations, and I'm very interested to hear what your thoughts are about what we should do for our 4th and final presentation. So at the end of this, I'm going to ask your opinions on where the conversation should go next. I've potentially left the next one open, and that's not because I wasn't organized and didn't have it ready, not at all. It's because, well, that too, and yeah, definitely interested to hear where this conversation should continue to go, because you know, we're definitely talking about a lot, but this is such a complex and multifaceted issue that there's a lot of other directions that we can take this conversation. Just a very quick recap, why a lecture series. This was identified in the engagement of the Community Climate Action Plan, which we're going to refer to as the CCAP, as a major, the public identified it as something that they'd really like to see. Unfortunately, since that time, COVID came together, so we can't gather in the same spot, but we're still trying to move forward and continue to nurture and nurture a community of learning and action. Also hoping that this can be a resource for teachers or others hoping to learn on their own time during this unprecedented time of our lives, and also a challenge, as Mayor Elliott said, you know, let's really intentionally making this hard and encouraging us to all think about and challenge ourselves with some difficult questions. And today you'll notice that the nature of the questions is going to change a little bit. I'm going to ask you a number of questions where there isn't a right answer, but very interested to see what the people on the chat think about, what response they feel is best. So for today, we're going to do a very quick overview of the science and the responses, and then head back into the Community Climate Action Plan a little bit more before continuing our focus toward adaptation, which is the second of two major responses to climate change. So as we talked about in week one and went over again last week, there are greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, notably carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane, among many others like sulfur dioxide, sulfur hexafluoride, and some other minor ones that serve to re-radiate long-wave radiation or heat. So most of the energy we get from the sun is short-wave radiation, so it gets absorbed by Earth and re-radiated or re-emitted as long-wave radiation. And when it's coming back through the atmosphere, these greenhouse gases quickly absorb and re-radiate this energy. A lot of it ends up back on Earth, and that makes our planet 33 degrees Celsius warmer than it would be without these gases. And it makes for a habitable planet and all sorts of wonderful things like plants and animals, etc. Also mitigates what would be huge swings between day and night. So this is our energy system or energy balance. However, as we are all very much aware, we have been putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since industrial times, notably CO2, and this has affected Earth's energy balance, mostly making it warmer. The effects of CO2 are also amplified or echoed by positive feedback cycles. So things like snow and ice albedo. So when you melt snow, you get often it melts over water or over dark land. So where a lot of energy was reflected, you get a lot of energy absorbed. Also, as we warm up the planet, we put more water vapor in the atmosphere because a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor, and water vapor is itself a greenhouse gas. So the effects of extra CO2 in the atmosphere get roughly doubled by these positive feedback cycles. So I'm really hoping this is a good review in that everyone who has heard it in the last couple of lectures is bored, and anyone who's tuning into the first time has no idea what I'm talking about. As an ex-professor, that's really the level you're trying to hit. Okay, and last week we talked a little bit more about human responses. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, issued a special report in 2018 that articulated that we will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in about 2040, they believe, but 2030 to 2052 is the range, without significant changes. 1.5 degrees Celsius has been identified as a safe threshold of warming, which is to say it's generally agreed upon as a level of change that both natural and human systems can mostly adjust and adapt. There are still definite losers in a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming scenario. However, most people in most natural systems will be able to adjust, and we won't see large changes on Earth. Keep in mind that we are already encountered almost a degree Celsius of change. So this is another 0.5 degrees Celsius. This report has not been accompanied by, but at the same time, there's been a real groundswell of concern over the last 18 months, largely fueled by youth, as well as mounting natural disasters that have unfortunately occurred throughout the Earth. So a real urgency about properly and seriously addressing climate change. That is a point in time that we are at right now, with a little bit of a hiccup with COVID, which has ironically turned our attention away from climate, but also been a very effective downward driver of emissions. And that might be something we decide to talk about next week. So when we created the Community Climate Action Plan, we were able to do some very detailed modeling on emissions within the district. So on this slide, you can see is a business as usual emissions scenario. So tallied together, this is by sector, but without any intervention by the local government, we'll see emissions stay about the same. So emissions actually per capita will go down a little bit because there will be some growth. However, we need to hit that red line if we are going to be in line with the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius report. And the District of Squamish declared a climate emergency in July of 2019, essentially saying that we will do everything in our power and will achieve the goals outlined in the 1.5 degrees Celsius report. So we need to get on that red line. That line is sharpward downward trending, whereas the business as usual is straight across. So obviously there needs to be significant action. The Community Climate Action Plan outlines actions to get us close to that level in the form of 6 big moves. So each of the 6 big moves has strategies, and within the strategies, there's 1 to 5 actions. And we talked about these in a little bit of detail last week, and I'm gonna go into a couple of them some more this week. So by enacting the measures in the Community Climate Action Plan, our fabulous climate modelers were able to project that this is our emissions trajectory. Keep in mind that we're only aiming to 2030 at this point. As we get closer to 2030, we have to kind of realign our scope to 2040 and beyond. So the fact that the 2040 and 2050 targets are not being met is not of big concern right now. This essentially assumes that at 2030, we high-five each other and shake hands and dust off and call it a day. But at that point, of course, we have to put more and more actions into place. And keep in mind, we talked about this last week, but we aren't there. This plan does not get us to our projected, what we estimate our target needs to be. Keep in mind, this is all modeling, so there is inherent uncertainty. We have to go beyond what is in this plan. So we have to keep thinking of new things to do, responding to technologies, et cetera, and pushing ourselves forward. Okay, so this is a different type of question that I've answered previously, in that there is not a right answer in the back of the book that we can look up. But what I'm curious to know, to those listening who have the ability to respond, is how should Squamish allocate resources between 2 of our big moves? So the big move 2 is focused on active transportation and transit. So getting people out of their cars, changing urban form, having more buses available to people so that they don't have to use private automobiles to get around. So that's one of the big moves. And the other one is decarbonizing transportation, which electric vehicles is kind of rising to the top of the priority list, or is emerging as the technology that is most likely to realize this. So should we put 20% of our money into helping people decarbonize, allowing people to, even subsidizing EVs, more charging stations, making it easier to get a private charging station? So should we put more money into decarbonizing transportation or more money into active transport and transit? So please take a minute and chew on this. If you're with other people in the room, have a little discussion about it and choose which proportionality makes the most sense to you. So more money on decarbonized versus transit, or more money on transit versus decarbonized. So 31, 38, 19, and 12%, roughly. Okay, so it looks like B is the answer what people arrived at. Of course, there's no correct answer to this. This is, there's no magic formula, but most people looking to invest more money in transit and transportation, which is exactly the same exactly the same reaction that I had when looking at these 2. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about both of these big moves. And again, I'm not trying to convince anyone about this. Just going to try to show some information to try to challenge us a little bit more to think pragmatically about. So these 2 big moves, the target for big move 2, shift beyond the car, was a doubling of active transport and transit trips, which correlates to a 15% decrease in the number of single occupant vehicle trips. It actually correlated to less than a 15% reduction in GHGs, because a lot of the trips that are taken in Squamish are to Vancouver and back. So you tend to bike or take transit in shorter trips and take your own vehicle for longer trips. The projected reduction was 2,500 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. This was something that Council was not thrilled about. This does not seem like a very ambitious target. And we certainly agreed, but the modelers were not able to come up with or very few examples of communities of this size being able to achieve more than this amount. That is not to say we won't achieve it, but we weren't able to kind of push to defensively push the model further than this target. And the target for Big Move 3, or decarbonizing transportation, is 50% of private vehicles will be electric and 10% of fleet vehicles by 2030. And this goal has a much larger carbon reduction outcome of 12,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So Big Move 2 and Big Move 3 are both identified as priorities. However, Big Move 3 has a higher carbon reduction level associated with it. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through these in more detail, but we'll certainly put this presentation online afterward. But the Big Move 2 strategies, some of them are just a little bit harder to influence people. So things like improving urban form pretty much underlies all of the other actions in Big Move 2. The closer together people live, just by virtue of that, it's easier to provide transit, it's easier to incentivize active transportation, gets more people working locally, and disincentivize private vehicle use on its own. So urban form is kind of a upstream of most of those other ones. And the Big Move 3 strategies are a little bit more direct, enhancing public charging infrastructure, support the use and purchase of passenger EVs. And, there's all sorts of different ways to go about that, whether it be just providing information, or you could even go so far as a local government matching incentives, etc. So these are the two strategies housed within these Big Moves. And I've got a pop quiz for you. So in internal combustion, which essentially takes the chemical energy stored in the bonds of the gasoline and converts it to thermal energy, or heat, and then to kinetic energy, movement, which is what you want because you want your car to go, is about 18% efficient. So 18% of the actual energy that's converted to heat by the explosion is translated into motion. So little less than 1/5 of it makes you continue to go forward. Lots of other things go into other types of heats the engine, etc., or sound. Approximately how efficient is an electric vehicle? So please take a minute and think about that and choose the answer you think is close to correct. So it looks like most people think it's C and some people think it is D. And the answer is actually C. So these are some numbers that I took from notes from Matt Blackman's presentation at the Squamish CAN EV event last March. Sorry, I didn't come up with another source for this, but it was a really excellent presentation, so I thought it was okay to just attribute it to Matt's research. So in internal combustion engine, or ICE, about 17 to 21% efficient, where an EV is a little over 60% efficient on average. So a much higher proportion of the energy translates into movement. So that's worthwhile to note, and that was something that I certainly wasn't aware of. Another statistic that absolutely blew my mind was when you're thinking about the number of moving parts. In a standard internal combustion engine car, we have about 2,000, and in an EV, we have about 25. So, about 2 orders of magnitude more moving parts. I think we can all imagine the amount of mechanical work and the amount of degradation associated with those two different numbers. So one thing that really excites me when I read more about it is there's potential for EVs to have far longer lives than internal combustion engines. A friend of mine who owns an EV, one thing that she told me is that the only thing she puts in her car, it's only a year old, is windshield wiper fluid. So that also, I am an internal combustion engine owner, that was something that certainly piqued my interest. Other things, there are very notable advances happening in electric vehicles. So battery lives are getting better, and battery recycling is also turning. There are technologies coming on board that enhance the recycling capabilities. And one thing that I was really interested to learn more about is that a battery for an EV needs to be a very high performing battery, and they degrade over time. But so an EV, you replace your battery when it's at about 90% capacity. However, a battery that is at 90% capacity can still be repurposed for many other uses. So for example, you could take your old EV and put it in your house, say you had solar or wind energy that you were getting off the grid, and use it as its own storage mechanism for your personal home. Battery recycling should also get better. And another big unknown is where are you getting your electricity from? So are you getting your electricity from coal, from wind, from hydro, etc.? Do remember that even if you are using the same source, so even if you were burning gasoline for electricity, you're still getting a higher proportion of energy translated into. So here is another. Sorry, I believe it's by the Fraser Basin Council, did an assessment of emissions of associated with EVs. And they found that EVs have about twice as much primary energy associated with them in the manufacturing process, so with double the emissions associated with it. So those are the blue lines. However, there are lower emissions associated with using it. So the middle line and the right line is an EV charge in Alberta, which would be primarily coal powered, or an EV charged in British Columbia, which is primarily hydro. So the crossover amount, where you have about the same amount of emissions in British Columbia, is about 30,000 kilometers. Please note that this is a very high estimate of primary energy during construction. The other estimate by the Union of Concerned Science is that it's about 20% higher. So, different ways to calculate that, and I definitely encourage you to look at a couple of different sources. So yeah, so this was just some information that I found very enlightening. Absolutely not. Don't think that only EVs are the answer. Thinking about that equity piece that Mayor Elliott told us about before, where we really need to think about all people, not just those who can afford an EV. And also thinking about beyond 2030, getting to those 70%, 80% net carbon neutral targets. Even an electric vehicle won't get us there. So we, even alongside electric vehicles, we still need to be using far less of them. Another really noteworthy consideration too is we only have so much low carbon energy, even in British Columbia. So we have to think very carefully what we spend that energy on. Okay, so I've shown you this a couple of times. It's a very, very informational diagram that has a lot of implications. And I want to use it again to express how adaptation and mitigation are necessary responses. Mary Elliott actually explained this very well, so I'll go over it quickly. But the one thing I want you to look at is so what we have to the right of the vertical black line is two scenarios. So the red line is a business as usual scenario. Essentially, we keep doing what we usually do. And the blue line is a very aggressive mitigation scenario that gets us to about 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, keeps us there. But when you look for the first 40 years of this, at 2050, these two lines have very minimal deviation between each other. So at 2050, we are close to 1.5 degrees warming, no matter what we do right now, short of intensive geoengineering or interference with the climate system. So we have a certain amount of warming in the pipe for another generation or so, regardless of what we do. And for that reason, adaptation is absolutely a necessary response. Mitigation is the response that's going to tell us which path we are at. And mitigation is an absolutely necessary response too, because the red line is a pretty, sorry for using dramatic language, but for lack of a better term, it's a pretty scary scenario. When you start to look at 4 degrees Celsius of warming, you start to look at hundreds of millions of people affected by flooding annually, numbers of extinctions closing in on 50% of plant and animal species. So, pretty much universally agreed upon by scientists that 4 degrees Celsius of warming in a short period of time is catastrophic. So here's a discussion question for you. So if Squamish had $10 million hypothetical dollars to spend in its climate change budget, and had to divvy that up between adaptation and mitigation, how should that money be spent? So should we spend 20% on mitigation and 80% on adaptation, or the two middle ones, or 80% on mitigation and 20% on adaptation? So do we protect ourselves, or do we put in our quarter into the well to invest in a lower carbon future? Interested to hear your points on. Okay, it looks like D ended up taking the top prize, but not by much. A really even spread. One thing I noticed that was really fascinating is that the longer people thought, the closer to A they ended up on. So I think people had really good intentions and wanted to, do the honorable thing and invest in a low carbon future. But the longer people ruminated about it, the more they ended up spending on adaptation. When I taught courses, I had one really interesting response where the individual, I didn't ask this exact question, but an individual said something to the point is, we're going to spend 95% of our money on adaptation, but we're going to spend 5% of communications money on telling everyone we're doing mitigation, kind of like a prisoner's dilemma. So hopefully everyone else will mitigate and we'll still realize that. But of course, there's no correct answer to this, but I'm going to talk about that more in a second. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead. I'll come back to this. So this is very embarrassing to show right now because I'm sitting across from a communications expert who specializes in visualizations. So yes, I did borrow my kids' markers to draw this on a piece of paper and then took a photo of it. So it is not a computer-generated, parameterized, optimized, simulated model, but it is a quick kind of visualization of how I see adaptation and mitigation working together. I definitely didn't think of this. This is from an article by Swart and Weaver, two scientists who study this. So what it looks at is on the y-axis, we have cost, how much money these two responses cost. And on the x-axis, we have how much temperature change. So the red line, or mitigation, we can see that if we don't do anything, if we don't spend any money, mitigation doesn't cost anything. However, as we get closer and closer to 1 degree or less, mitigation gets more and more expensive. Of course, some emissions are really cheap, and I purposely drew this line flat for a while because you can actually save some money with some mitigation. But as you get to the harder and harder things to address, mitigation gets more and more expensive. Now, adaptation is kind of the opposite, that we don't have to spend any money on adaptation if there's no temperature change. However, when we get to 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius, the number gets incredibly high. And you could probably argue that both of these at some point get infinite. Right, it's almost impossible to get to remove all of the emissions that are in the atmosphere, and it becomes impossible to adapt to 4 or 5 plus Celsius. So what I'm doing here is theoretically, there could be a point at which these two overlap where we would realize kind of the most cost-effective solution. So this is just another visualization of how adaptation and mitigation are both necessary responses. I'm going to go back here. And at Quest, we have breakout activities, and I'll try it with you. Feel free to just take a minute to check on your kids or stand up and walk around. But if you're feeling up to it, what I would like you to do is pick a sector or a topic that you are interested in. So agriculture is a great one. Water resource management is another really interesting one. Energy production, buildings, transportation. And what I would like you to do is I'm going to show you a diagram. And on it, I would like you to very quickly kind of visualize or even draw a hypothetical situation that addresses each of the scenarios. So in the bottom left, we have a scenario where you're not adapting or mitigating. So you're doing nothing. You're not taking either of those into account. That can be kind of a fun one to think about. On the top left, you're in a scenario where we're adapting, but we are increasing our emissions. So we're doing things to adjust to temperature changes that ultimately make for more temperature changes themselves. On the bottom right category, we're doing the opposite of that. We're mitigating, but we're doing that in such a way that we are making ourselves more vulnerable to future changes. And in the top right, which is of course where we want to try to end up, is that you're doing both right away at the same time. So try to think of a scenario where you are both making yourself less vulnerable and also lowering the amount of emissions that you are producing. So take a minute and think about that. If you want to kind of quickly draw 4 out, that'd be great. And yeah, have fun. Okay, so I took a stab at this just using visuals that I found online. So this is my stab. You probably thought of much cleverer ones, but so in the bottom left we have a scenario where we're not doing anything. So if you build a mansion right on the edge of the ocean and cut down the mangrove forest in front of it, that's a good example of that. We're very vulnerable to future impacts of climate change, and we are also increasing emissions. So on the top left, there's a situation where we're adapting. So if you build a house by the ocean and build it 3 meters above water level so that it can be inundated at the bottom and not suffer any infrastructure damage. However, you're still building a 14-bedroom mansion that is powered by coal, say. It's not very efficient, very large footprint, huge emissions associated with building it. On the bottom right, we have just a simplification of a tiny home that is very energy efficient. But however, you build it right next to the ocean, so you're vulnerable to sea level rise. And on the top right is a visualization of a tiny home that is built on a floating platform so that it could adjust to floods and sea level. So you're both enhancing you are adapting, you are less vulnerable, and you are also mitigating or reducing the amount of emissions. So naturally, we want to be thinking at all times of getting ourselves in that upper right quadrant wherever possible. I'll pull up those questions from the chat at the end, just because we want to keep moving along here. I'm going to skip over these. They're here for your reference, but we're running a little bit short on time. Okay. So looking more specifically at adapting to climate change in Squamish, we talked about this in week 1, but the projected temperature change from a 1961 to 90 baseline is 1.7 degrees Celsius for the southern coast area, and about 6% increase in precipitation. But do note that the range of precipitation change is quite large. So there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that projection. And I was part of, in 2015 and 2016, a number of us came together to create an adaptation strategy, and I was not at the district at the time, but I helped with it. And the near-term priorities were identified to be obviously sea level rise and increased forest fires, and also extreme precipitation. So these are impacts associated with climate change that the District of Squamish needs to be thinking about right away that have significant negative consequences associated. Long-term priorities were also identified, and they are also very important. However, they don't need to necessarily be, it doesn't necessarily need to be a top priority right away. Definitely need to be thinking about them. There are potential for impacts associated. They are changing river flows, water supply vulnerability. In Squamish, we are very lucky to have a very abundant, clean, and proximal water supply. It's even up gradient from us, so we don't even have to input energy to get it. Economic development. So a lot of impacts associated with climate change will affect our economy, especially an area like ours that is so dependent on tourism. And then health. So things like heat waves, extreme events, vector-borne diseases, air quality, illness, etc. And finally, agriculture and food security. Agriculture is an area associated with climate change that could have potential positive impacts. Do remember that the word impact is a value neutral term. So it doesn't necessarily mean bad, although we usually think of it as such. So the first priority is sea level rise. Probably most of you would have guessed that. I didn't bother making that a poll. We also have our engineering manager, I forget our engineer, who is in charge of our sea level rise strategy and our integrated flood hazard management plan. David Rolston is with us tonight. So I'm going to give a very quick introduction. And for those of you who have questions, David has kindly agreed to be here to answer. So we were instructed, or the literature shows that the lower mainland should plan for 1 meter of SLR, which is sea level rise, by 2100 and 2 meters by 2200, as is shown in this diagram. And initiatives that the District of Squamish has been involved in, we have participated in the lower mainland flood management strategy. So this is a larger regional strategy to try to address flooding for the whole kind of area proximal to Vancouver. It's a bit of a no-brainer when you think about it from a high level. Of course, if you live here and your neighbor lives here and you build a seawall and your neighbor doesn't build one, you're probably not going to look next door and say, oh, that sucker, they don't have a seawall, because of course the water is just going to go right around. You really want to be careful to work together and manage sea level rise in a coherent and coordinated manner. You also want to realize economies of scale and build to similar standards. That being said, it's been a very tricky and careful process to go forward, because different municipalities have different resources and different amounts of risks that they're willing to tolerate. It's a really fascinating example of where the science and the human element come together, but that is moving forward. And the District of Squamish has created an integrated flood hazard management plan, or the IFHMP, which was adopted in 2017. I'm going to talk about this a little bit, and David is again on hand to answer some questions. So here's just a very quick overview of some of the flood hazards in Squamish. Part of the cost of living in such a spectacular and unique environment is that we have an embarrassment of natural calamities at our back door, and some of us at our front door. So we are at the confluence of 5 major river systems. It is a tectonically active area. We are at Howe Sound, which is an inlet of the Pacific Ocean. Also subject to geological hazards like rockfall, landslides, and debris flow hazards. So in this diagram, you can see a few of these hazards. So a lot of downtown and surrounding areas are located just a couple of meters above sea level rise. They're exposed to coastal flood hazards resulting from a combination of high tides, storm surge, and waves. And of course, sea level rise is expected to exacerbate this hazard. Most of Squamish is also located in the river floodplains of the Squamish, Mamquam, Cheakamus, Squamish, and Chekai rivers. These overlap with the coastal floodplain area at different points. And then the neighborhood of Brackendale at the north end is also located on a large alluvial fan that is known as the Chekai fan. So there are huge debris flows associated with Garibaldi that inundate this area from time to time. So planning for all of these together with other lens, even without climate change, is a very noble task on its own. So here's a 1 in 200 year flood map with 1 meter of sea level rise laid upon it. So please don't think that this is what 1 meter of sea level rise will look like in the area. So again, this is a flood that has a 0.5% chance of happening each year. So this level is 4.59 meters geodetic. So this is extreme combinations of tide, storm surges, wind, and waves, and also sea level rise accompanying that. So this is at risk. What is at risk from a 1 in 200 year flood? Keep in mind that a lot of the areas that are shown in yellow are already at risk from coastal flood. So the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan, in my opinion, is a very comprehensive document. And one of the most impressive aspects about it is it looks at and carefully considers a number of types of responses. So when you think about sea level rise, typically protecting or taking existing development and not changing its current form, not changing its location, and just make sure that it's safe where it is usually kind of the first response that comes to mind. But there are three other responses that are noted in it. One is accommodating. So you can change infrastructure so that the potential consequences of are less severe to flooding. So things like increasing the floodplain construction level, having lower stories of buildings that can accommodate flooding and not have large damages associated with. Another one is managed retreat. So you can gradually withdraw potentially vulnerable infrastructure and services from hazardous areas. This is one, of course, that a lot of people, myself included, it's definitely a tricky conversation to have. And finally, probably the most cost-effective one is avoiding. So not putting new development or increasing density in areas that are potentially hazardous. So just very quickly, here's an overview of some of the protect measures. And when you're thinking about protection or planning for sea level rise, it's really interesting to think about what type of protection infrastructure you're trying to build. One thing, as you can see on the left, there is more natural values can be conserved by a lower slope dike or system. However, it takes a lot of physical area. So typically these, Dave can correct me if I'm incorrect, but they're built on a slope that's about 1 to 5. So if you build a 1 meter dike, that's going to be 10 meters wide because it needs to be 5 meters on each end. And usually you have a path or something on top of it. And that is a lot of area to have to think about preserving or protecting or not developing. On the right side, you can see kind of a more kind of engineered approach that has a steeper wall associated with it. So you don't lose much of any physical area or land. However, this is very expensive. So at this point, I would like to invite people to ask David, our engineer, some more questions. And David is far more knowledgeable on this subject, so we'll be able to provide more information. Also, David, this would be a great point to correct anything I've said that was incorrect.
Thanks, Ian. Well, one thing I would say is with regards to the sloping dike that is planned for the west side of downtown, is that I'd say generally flatter slopes are more conducive to vegetation and bioengineering for erosion protection. You referenced a 5-to-1 slope. A Green Shores slope could be anywhere from a 10-to-1 to a 3-to-1 slope. So, 5-to-1 is sort of in that middle range. Often on the land side of the dike, the slope would be steeper, so wouldn't necessarily need a 5-to-1 slope on the land side. Often we see a 2-to-1 slope there, and the key thing just being that it's stable. But yeah, other than that, I think you addressed it well. And so if there's any questions, happy to answer them.
Look at
that. There was one question I see Nick asked with regards to how are we adjusting flood frequency for climate change. So I think you might get into that, Ian. But with regards to river flooding, we have basically done some statistical analysis and evaluated whether our rivers are showing any sort of statistical trend and in terms of an increase in peak flows. And we haven't actually noticed that through our statistical analysis. And so we're following provincial guidelines on that. And we've applied a 10% increase on our peak river flows. That's in line with provincial guidance by the engineers and geoscientists of BC.
David, I have Am I unmuted? I have a quick question for you. Is there any examples of retreat that have been enacted or planned to be enacted in Squamish? Or is there any infrastructure that we're relocating?
Yes, we're actually in the midst right now of planning to relocate our emergency operations center out of the floodplain. So currently it's in a shared location with the RCMP building, which is in the Squamish and Mamquam River floodplains. And we're currently looking at relocating that up to the fire hall in Valley Cliff. So in the event of a flood, we would be high and dry and able to enact emergency operations.
Interesting.
There is a question about whether it's a 10% increase in peak flow to the main stem and tributaries. My understanding is that it's a 10% increase to all the main stem rivers.
Great. And I actually do have I realize we didn't talk about projected changes yet of flooding. And I have a slide on that in a little. Thanks so much, David. I understand that it might be bedtime at your household, so if you have to go, we totally understand. But if you are still around, if there's questions at the end, we might see if you're still there.
I'll stick around.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, and David's email is on this slide if people have an inclination or a question that comes up later. Again, David is just a phenomenal example of what it means to be a good engineer, a very thoughtful person. And I was wondering what would be the best way to thank a humble person like David. And David doesn't like the spotlight at all. So I thought it'd be really nice of me to show you all of his recent running results. He's quite an accomplished runner. He's also probably going to be turning a little red because of this. And the problem with doing this is I really can't run away looking at his marathon time. So I'll have to climb a tree or something. So just kidding, but thanks again, David. Okay, another major impact that was identified is forest fires. So there are very strong evidence of increases related to both magnitude or the size of fires and the frequency or the number of fires. This is another really tricky one. You have to be very careful about what you attribute an increase in forest fires to, because there's lots of causes of forest fires and there's lots of other things we do to forest systems. So things like forest practices, things like increased development close to forests, things like increased recreation in forested areas. But a very strong attribution has been shown that fires relate to temperature, precipitation, snowpack, soil moisture, and droughts. And the biggest predictor of fire in a season is usually mean July temperature. So if you want to understand how bad a fire temperature is going to be, a lot of that can be explained by early to midsummer temperatures. So as you are all aware, we've had a number of very difficult fire seasons in Western Canada. So dating back to the 2003 fires in Kelowna, the 2015 Pemberton fires, the 2016 Fort McMurray fire, and the 2017 and the 2018 seasons were both very bad as well. So just to put some of these into a bit of context, 2017 was the worst fire season in 60 years, and then 2018 happened. And this is a chart that shows the units of kilometers squared burned. So we had a fire season that was the worst in 60 years and immediately followed up by another one that was significantly worse than that. So the odds of that happening without climate change are very, very small. Not going to have time to get into it, but for those of you who are really interested in kind of opening under the hood and looking into this, there's a really cool article on detection and attribution of forest fires to anthropogenic climate change. And you can do all sorts of really interesting statistics to see what proportion of the attributable risk was associated with human-caused climate change. So for those of you who are interested, you can click on this link of the PDF we will put on afterward. These are all scientists based in Western Canada as well. Francis Zweers is one of them, and he was the individual I interviewed about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change work that I reported on last week. Andrew Weaver is actually another one many people know. Okay, this is not for the BC's Lower Mainland, but just some interesting analysis that I was part of a few years ago. So when you're doing projections into the future, often it's not the median or mean increase that you're actually that worried about, because your maximum precipitation events tend to increase more rapidly than the mean events. So this was some analysis we did for northern British Columbia, and the 1 in 20 year event was projected to get 34% greater. So this gets interesting. I noticed there was a comment on the chat earlier, but so what was once a there's a couple of ways you can look at this. So what was once a 1 in 20 year event may now be a 1 in 12 year event or a 1 in 15 year event, or you can say a 1 in 20 year event is 30% more severe. Again, when you're dealing with the public, it's a really tricky thing to communicate. So, because a 1 in 20 year event, just because it happened last year, doesn't mean you get 19 years off. So it's something that a lot of people have some trouble wrapping their heads around. Okay, so before we talk about flooding and climate impacts on that, just have a little physical geography question for you, just for fun. So rivers, where the majority of their discharge comes from snow, are referred to as this, and rivers where most discharge comes from, comes from rain, are this. So one of these answers is correct. I'll give you a hint. D, you could argue is correct, but there is a more correct answer. Looks like we have a number of physical geographers in our midst. Work. So nival and pluvial are the terms. Okay, so as David touched upon, one of the issues about dealing with flooding and sea level rise in Squamish is that one just doesn't happen on one side of our community and one at the other. The two come into very close quarters with each other. And you have to be very careful, because a strategy designed to keep the ocean at bay could very effectively keep the rivers in our community as well. So that's what's known as the bathtub effect. And we have to be very careful not to, by trying to keep the ocean out, we keep the rivers in. So something to think about. So Squamish is at risk of flooding in all 5 of the major rivers. And this was incorporated into the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan. And no statistical evidence was found of climate change increased flooding in Squamish. However, as David mentioned, a 10% accounting was put on top of it. So it's kind of a 10% buffer for future potential impacts. So what I've shown here is a hydrograph or flow throughout the year of a river in northeastern British Columbia. This was part of the same study as the extreme precipitation. And climate change tends to affect nival rivers more significantly than pluvial, as largely because in the winter, you get less snowpack and more rain events in the winter. So this is a projection. The green line shows what a 2050 projected flow is for this. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with this, because river flows depend on temperature change affects them, and precipitation change affects them. And temperature change, of course, affects the phase of precipitation, which has big implications for when that precipitation flows down as discharge in the river. But what tends to happen is you get higher winter flows and an earlier freshet. So you get the spring flooding event happening earlier, but you tend to get lower flows in July, August, and September. Unfortunately, that is a major problem in some areas, because this is when water levels are most stressed, and also when humans are placing the most demand on water. This is when people are watering their lawn. This is when farmers are watering their crops. This is also when animals like salmon need water in the streams, and they need the water to be as cold as possible. So by having less water in them, you are raising the temperature. So some analysis we did in northeastern British Columbia, we picked 7 rivers were picked. And so the 20-year high event change is shown on the left, and then the 10-year return low event percent change is shown on the right. And it's not totally, it doesn't seem entirely logical to have an increase in both high return events and low return events. But if you look at the previous hydrograph, that starts to kind of to show itself a little bit more. And of course, you show a group of farmers or a group of people in the oil and gas industry these numbers, and the big response is, so what? What is a 22% change in 10-year return low events happen? So we did a little bit of math and turned these numbers around, and we were able to show that this is what the old 1 in 20-year event was going to be in 2050 under these projections. So as you can see, for a lot of these rivers, what was once a 1 in 20-year event is a 1 in 19-year event or a 1 in 12-year event. So that wasn't hugely concerning. However, the 1 in 10-year low events, the return period for most of the rivers was down to 1 in 2-year events. So it used to be a 10% chance of happening. So you used to be rolling a 10-sided die. Now you're flipping a coin. So that is a big effect that has a lot of implications for northeastern British Columbia. A lot of agriculture in the area and a large amount of water demand also for the oil and gas industry in fracking. Okay, I apologize. We've kept you a little bit late tonight, but a very quick overview of what we've talked about. We're going to come back a little bit to adaptation next week and then continue on the conversation. But hopefully I've been able to reinforce what Mayor Elliott noted at the beginning, that both adaptation and mitigation are necessary responses to climate change. So these are kind of the 2 major human responses that are clearly outlined in the IPCC, and there's a huge amount of research being done on them. The other major response that is kind of poking its way in the door more and more is geoengineering, or interference with the climate system. We are getting closer and closer, and some would argue that we've already passed a point where we have to start manipulating Earth's energy balance or making it so that we can take more carbon out of the atmosphere by various means. So right now, if we had this conversation 30 years ago, this would have all been about mitigation, and I would have said that adaptation was a waste of time because why adapt when we can avoid the problem? Now both adaptation and mitigation are front and center, and a lot of people are saying, let's not go crazy and go geoengineering when we can mitigate and adapt. And in 10 more years, maybe geoengineering is going to be just as big of a part of this puzzle as adaptation and mitigation. So just a little bit of food for thought that we're entering into more and more, for lack of a better term, interesting times with this. So Squamish will be impacted by climate change, but fortunately has a very high adaptive capacity. So we have a lot of resources at hand. We have a very high standard of living, very high tax base, etc., compared to most other communities in the world. So please keep that in mind, that Squamish is capable of adapting to a lot more than a lot of other areas in the world are. Sea level rise, forest fires, and extreme precipitation have been highlighted as near-term priorities for us. So before we call it a day, I have one last question for you all. And the question is, what should we talk about next week? So this is going to be the final talk. And I have a number of ideas of things that I'd be really interested in going over. But I'd love to hear your feedback for those of you who are still with us. So 5 ideas that I have, and I'm going to ask this question twice, so you could pick your first one in the first round and the second one in the second round. What I just alluded to is geoengineering. So happy to kind of provide a bit of information and lead a bit of discussion on that. Another one is thinking about different frames or responses to climate change. So, there's very different ways that we can package this challenge. Is climate change a problem that's fundamentally linked to technology? Is it a problem that's fundamentally moral? Is it a development problem, etc.? And there's really interesting different ways to package the challenge of climate change that elicit different responses. So we can kind of think about that. One would be major barriers to action. So primarily would look at psychological barriers and what are some of the reasons that people don't act in response to climate change, whereas people act very significantly in response to other things like COVID. This brings us to D, which is COVID and climate change. So thinking about some of the things we've done lately with COVID, and maybe we can carry over some of those wins, or what are some lessons that we can take from this challenge and apply it to climate. And then finally, if you would like to talk more about adaptation and resilience. We'll give you a minute to think about this once over, and then we'll do it again, and then we'll call it. Okay, we'll just do it once then. Okay, do we have? Hey, very interesting. So different frames or responses or ways to think about the challenge is the highest one, and also COVID and climate change. Okay, so I'll take that into account, and definitely can focus on those two for next week. So yeah, there have been a number of questions in the polls. Yes, absolutely, Nick. That's what I was trying to get at, is that the dichotomy between adaptation and mitigation is limited and faulty. It's really interesting history that, right from the beginning, right when the IPCC was created, Al Gore actually was the one who famously stood up and said that we shouldn't even be thinking about mitigation right now. It's an arrogant way to go forward, and it presumes that we're not going to do anything. So it's kind of interesting in context that adaptation right at the beginning of the conversation was kind of pushed aside. But you're absolutely right that both adaptation and mitigation have the same intended consequence at the end of the day, which is to reduce the undesirable impacts of climate change. So one without the other is fundamentally limited, and we have to be doing both at the same time. Yes, if anyone wants to put their hand up as well, I'll move through these questions. The RCP scenarios, Matthew, that's a good question. So that's the last assessment report switched over to RCP, which are representative concentration pathway scenarios. They are pretty similar to the previous IPCC scenarios, but there was a different methodology. But the four scenarios are fairly analogous to the scenarios that are in the previous assessment report. So they're definitely still relevant. The RCP ones are just a little bit more recent. An interesting fun fact, the number of the RCP scenario correlates to the extra amount of energy we'd be receiving from them in watts per meter squared. So the RCP 8.5 indicates that we'd be getting like 349 watts per meter squared, not 341. So it's I find that kind of cool. Comes back to the energy balance stuff. Yeah, some really good responses about marrying adaptation and mitigation. Is this a metaphor for van life? Yes, some would say it is. Celebrating low carbon lifestyles, and maybe things that we consider to be more alternative, maybe they shouldn't be passed as such. All right, looks like David jumped in and answered a number of questions. Thanks, David. That's an interesting point about geoengineering. Not considered a realistic approach at this point by anyone. I would respectfully disagree with that. I think a number of, for example, the RCP 2.6 scenario has a significant amount of geoengineering in it. It's certainly very expensive, but one really interesting point is that it doesn't have to be expensive. There's things that we can do that are actually pretty cheap. However, I think most of us can agree that doing things like putting a bunch of sulfates in giant weather balloons and putting them up into the atmosphere and exploding them to block out incoming radiation, there's certainly big uncertainties associated with it. So, not necessarily expensive, certainly risky, certainly not optimal or ideal, certainly high stakes. However, as we're going boldly forward with our carbon emissions increasing, there's, that may have to become more and more a part of the conversation. Right? Does anyone have their? Okay. I just want to, before we wrap it up today, I just want to thank Sandra very much for her, all of her help on the communication side. It's certainly feel very comfortable to have a communications and technology expert with me at this. It'd be much more scary to be going on this alone. Also, huge thanks to Mayor Elliott for coming on and introducing this, and also to David Rolston for not only being such a fast runner, but being such a valuable resource to our community and answering these questions. Really, really appreciate all of your time. I know it's a tough time of day for all of you. And for those of you who can come next week, we'll love to have you back. And yeah, please enjoy the rest of your evening.